This is a recording of the International Communist Party, which maintains its direct line, running from Marx to Lenin, to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Leghorn, Livorno, 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian communist left against the degeneration in Moscow and to the rejection of popular fronts and coalitions of resistance groups. Today we will be reading from our theoretical magazines Comunismo and La Gauche Communiste, Part 2 of Communist Revolution and the Emancipation of Women, from the years 1979 and 1981. Part 1 has been released. Parts 3 and 4 will be released in subsequent videos. 3. The Modern Feminine Question. The Utopia of Inter-classist Feminism. We wrote that the woman's question in its modern sense precisely coincides with the ending of the family as an economic unit, and that it persists as a political framework for the sole aim of social conservation, able to hold together what capitalism has torn apart. The so-called family unit is in fact nonsense from the moment social production and organization becomes responsible for all of the functions which were previously the prerogative of a family. It was precisely at the time when millions of women were forced to look for work outside of the family, when an objective transformation of the structure of the family was taking place, that the first claims of women emerged, claims which involved women of all strata and all social classes. Clara Zetkin, in her speech at the German Social Democratic Party's Congress at Gotha on October 16, 1896, referring to the research of Bachhofen, Morgan, et al., declared, "Nonetheless, a woman's question in the modern sense of the term couldn't be said to exist. It was only the capitalist mode of production which created the societal transformation which brought forth the modern woman's question by destroying the old family economic system which provided both livelihood and life's meaning for the great majority of women during the pre-capitalist period. We must, however, not transfer to the ancient economic activities of women those concepts, the concepts of futility and pettiness, that we connect with the activities of women in our times. As long as the old type of family still existed, a woman found a meaningful life by productive activity. Thus, she was not conscious of her lack of social rights, even though the development of her potentials as an individual was strictly limited. The machines, the modern mode of production, slowly undermined domestic production, and not just for thousands but for millions of women, the question arose. Where do we now find our livelihood? Where do we find a meaningful life as well as a job that gives us mental satisfaction? Millions of women were now forced to find their livelihood and their meaningful lives outside of their families and within society as a whole. They then became conscious that their lack of rights made it difficult to protect their interests, and from this moment emerges the real, modern woman's question. The woman's question, however, is only present within those classes of society who are themselves the products of the capitalist mode of production. Thus it is that we find no women's question in peasant circles that possess a natural, although severely curtailed and punctured, economy. But we certainly find a women's question within those classes of society which are the most direct creations of the modern mode of production. There is a women's question for the women of the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, the intelligentsia, and the big bourgeoisie. It assumes a different form according to the class situation of each one of these strata. Clara Zetkin. Selected Writings. Haymarket Books, 2015, 72-74. The modern women's question is born at this point. From this time on, all women, ranging from bourgeois to proletarian, get drawn into the struggle because none of them have the political and civil rights that are granted to men. They aren't allowed to vote. They aren't allowed to organize. They are excluded from universities and the professions. Marriages are deemed indissoluble, and in cases of adultery, the female is punished, but not the male. They are without rights over their children. Property is held solely by the husband, etc. Even proletarian women had to fight to defend their right to work in industry against proletarian men who saw the working women as competitors who would lower their wages, an attitude which only softened when the proletariat gave rise to the Economic Association. To sum up, women had been left out of the democratic revolution and had yet to fight for their democratic rights, for equality with men. And it was from this that the feminist movements derived the justification for their existence, most famously the suffragettes. There is a description by Clara Zetkin which testifies to the bravery and fighting spirit of many bourgeois heroines, as genuine as many of those who fought in the bourgeois revolution. And yet, while recognizing the merits of this movement and the need for women, for all women, to win democratic rights, the party adopted as regards this issue the same analytical method and the same practice as it had towards the bourgeois revolution. No revolution by stages, that is, no submission by the proletarian woman to the bourgeois woman, not even during the fight for democratic rights. A clear separation between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat from the very beginning. What we want to make clear is that the Communist Party has never accepted the thesis of female people versus male people. Instead, it has revealed the bourgeois aims that propel the women of the bourgeoisie into the struggle, and the aims of proletarian women, clearly opposed, even if some of them momentarily converge. Proletarian women beware, warned the party. While for the bourgeoisie, democracy is an end in itself, for you it must be a means that will allow you to enter the class struggle, alongside proletarian men, for the conquest of political power. Zetkin continues, how does the women's question shape up as far as the upper 10,000 are concerned? The woman of the upper 10,000, thanks to her property, may freely develop her individuality and live as she pleases. In her role as wife, however, she is still dependent upon her husband. The guardianship of the weaker sex has survived in the family law, which still states, and he shall be your master. How is the family of the upper 10,000 constituted, in which the wife is legally subjugated by the husband? At its very founding, such a family lacks the moral prerequisites. Not individuality, but money decides the matrimony. Its motto is, what capital joins, sentimental morality must not part. Thus, in this marriage, 2 prostitutions are taken for 1 virtue. The eventual family life develops accordingly. Whenever a woman is no longer forced to fulfill her duties, she devolves her duties as spouse, mother, and housewife upon paid servants. If the women of these circles have the desire to give their lives a serious purpose, they must, first of all, raise the demand to dispose of their property in an independent and free manner. This demand, therefore, represents the core of the demands raised by the women's movement of the upper 10,000. These women, in their fight for the realization of their demand vis-à-vis the masculine world of their class, fight exactly the same battle that the bourgeoisie fought against all of the privileged estates, i.e., a battle to remove all social differences based upon the possession of property. Ibid. 74. So, a struggle between bourgeois factions. Separation of the assets. What bourgeois women aspire to, in other words, is the same right to extort surplus value from the proletariat as the men of their own class. Kollontai explains, the more right-wing feminists, those who, because of their social situation are part of the upper bourgeoisie, concentrate on 2 main problems. 1. Replacing religious with civil marriage, which at the same time would make divorce easier. 2. The possibility of dividing the property of the spouses in countries where this has not yet been established. These 2 claims, without any doubt, have a very great importance for women of the moyenne and haute bourgeoisie, for the representatives of capital in any of its forms. This for them would be the best way of defending their own economic interests, on the one hand protecting the common possessions of the father and mother by way of the civil marriage for the children, on the other maintaining their complete economic independence from their husbands. As representatives of the haute bourgeoisie, it is evidently in this spirit that our progressive women compelled us to elaborate their own claims as regards the question of the family. The program of the Progressive Women's Party states, as far as family law is concerned, it is necessary to institute marriage as a legal act, obligatory for all. The religious consecration of marriage must remain the free choice of each individual. Divorce will be made easier and the formalities simplified. Parents will need to exercise equal power over their children. Women will be equal to men in everything. She will have the rights to the family possessions, and legislation will need to make her economically independent of her husband if, for domestic reasons, she is unable to earn a living. In the same way, legislation must install a wide-reaching protection of the children, in particular those born outside the marriage. Setting out from the consideration that the economic and social structure is unchangeable, the progressive woman only wants to bring about some modifications to the present family relationships, modifications which nonetheless do not in any way strike at the roots of the bourgeois family. The modification introduced in this way has not only the aim of improving the reciprocal relationships between the people united by the mutual ties of marriage, but also that of solidifying the present form and making it more vital. Kollontai, Socialnie Osnovi. Zetkin continues further. How does the women's question appear in the circles of the petty bourgeois, the middle class, and the bourgeois intelligentsia? Here it is not property which dissolves the family, but mainly the concomitant symptoms of capitalist production. To the degree this production completes its triumphal march, the middle class and the petty bourgeois are hurtling further and further towards their destruction. Within the bourgeois intelligentsia, another circumstance leads to the worsening of the living conditions. Capitalism needs the intelligent and scientifically trained workforce. It therefore favored an overproduction of mental work proletarians and contributed to the phenomenon that the formerly respected and profitable societal positions of members of the professional class are more and more eroding. To the same degree, however, the number of marriages is decreasing, although on the one hand the material basis is worsening. On the other hand, the individual's expectations of life are increasing, so that a man of that background will think twice or even thrice before he enters into a marriage. The age limit for the founding of a family is raised higher and higher, and a man is under no pressure to marry, since there exists in our time enough social institutions which offer to an old bachelor a comfortable life without a legitimate wife. The capitalist exploitation of the proletarian workforce, through its starvation wages, sees to it that there is a large supply of prostitutes which corresponds to the demand by the men. Thus, within the bourgeois circles, the number of unmarried women increases all the time. The wives and daughters of these circles are pushed out into society so that they may establish for themselves their own livelihood, which is not only supposed to provide them with bread, but also with mental satisfaction. In these circles, women are not equal to men in the form of possessors of private property, as they are in the upper circles. The women of these circles have yet to achieve their economic equality with men, and they can only do so by making two demands: the demand for equal professional training and the demand for equal job opportunities for both sexes. In economic terms, this means nothing less than the realization of free access to all jobs and the untrammeled competition between men and women. The realization of this demand unleashes a conflict of interest between the men and women of the bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia. The competition of the women in the professional world is the driving force for the resistance of men against the demands of bourgeois women's rights advocates. Zetkin, 75. It is from the lack of property to share out, therefore, that a different attitude on the part of the feminist petty bourgeois intellectuals on the question of the family ensues. Whereas the right-wing feminists, the upper bourgeoisie, concern themselves with changing family legislation in their favor, as we have seen, the intellectuals are for absolute independence without any institution, men and women as equals on the labor market, and free love as far as sexual relations are concerned. As Kollontai puts it, the heroic struggle of individual young women of the bourgeois world, who fling down the gauntlet and demand of society the right to dare to love, without orders and without chains, ought to serve as an example for all women languishing in family chains. This is what is preached by the more emancipated feminists abroad, and our progressive equal writers at home. The marriage question, in other words, is solved in their view without reference to the external situation. It is solved independently of changes in the economic structure of society. The isolated, heroic efforts of individuals is enough. Let a woman simply dare, and the problem of marriage is solved. The feminists and the social reformers from the camp of the bourgeoisie, naively believing in the possibility of creating new forms of family and new types of marital relations against the dismal background of the contemporary class society, tie themselves in knots in their search for these new forms. If life itself has not yet produced these forms, it is necessary, they seem to imagine, to think them up whatever the cost. There must, they believe, be modern forms of sexual relationship which are capable of solving the complex family problem under the present social system. Kollontai, 66-68. As we can see, not revolutionary destruction of the capitalist system as uniquely responsible for, and creator of, every oppression, but rather a superimposition of new forms over the old. The feminists of the left, while clearly separating themselves from those of the right, who declare themselves preservers of the traditional family, find themselves objectively alongside them in conserving existing society. They fight the effects of their oppression and not its causes, forgetting that although private property, the real rotten surviving phenomenon to destroy, is best contained within the traditional family, it doesn't spare free unions, because it interposes itself into all relationships that people establish between themselves and this society. Kollontai continues, "How utopian these marriage formulas sound! How feeble these palliatives, when considered in the light of the gloomy reality of our modern family structure. Before these formulas of free relationships and free love can become practice, it is above all necessary that a fundamental reform, Kollontai clearly means reform in a revolutionary sense here, of all social relationships between people take place. Furthermore, the moral and sexual norms and the whole psychology of mankind would have to undergo a thorough evolution. Is the person psychologically able to cope with free love? What about the jealousy that eats into even the best human souls? And that deeply rooted sense of property that demands the possession not only of the body, but also of the soul of another? And the inability to have the proper respect for the individuality of another? The habit of either subordinating oneself to the loved one, or of subordinating the loved one to oneself? And the bitter and desperate feeling of desertion, of limitless loneliness, which is experienced when the love ceases to love and leaves. Where can the lonely person, who is an individualist to the very core of his being, find solace? The collective, with its joys and disappointments and aspirations, is the best outlet for the emotional and intellectual energies of the individual. But is modern man capable of working with this collective in such a way as to feel the mutually interacting influences? Is the life of the collective really capable, at present, of replacing the individual's petty personal joys? Without the unique, one and only, twin soul, even the socialist, the collectivist, is quite alone in the present antagonistic world. Only in the working class do we catch the pale glimpse of the future, of more harmonious and more social relations between people. The family problem is as complex and many-faceted as life itself. Our social system is incapable of solving it. Ibid, 68-89. We need to emphasize, however, that in criticizing this petty bourgeois deviation, we are not seeking to prompt greater sympathy for the traditional family, not even in a hypocritical way, while waiting to take power. As we have already shown, legal wife and prostitute are in many cases two sad sides of the same coin. We are opposed to the ideology of free love only inasmuch as it tries to replace revolution as a way of solving once and for all the problem of the relationship between the sexes. On the contrary, we want to make it very clear that it is feminism itself, as an ideology, that wishes to distort into a self-sufficient political finality the positive tendency of millions of women in search for their own inner and outer independence, an affirmation of their own individuality as they seek to remove themselves from the wardship of men in order to try and re-establish a relationship that is equal rather than antagonistic. The search for free love, if purged of all radical bourgeois ideologies and from the anathema of conservatives and reactionaries, is an aspect of the affirmation of themselves as human beings for which millions of women feel the need. New forms of relationships between the sexes cannot assert themselves without entirely shattering the existing social order, but the process leading to this finality is already recognizable in the independent path being followed, despite the difficulties, by so many women, and which in fact derives from the increasing decomposition of current institutions. Under the influence of capitalist production, millions of women have been forced to enter the collectivity that exists outside the family, and therefore, at the same time, to contradict their own recently held image of themselves as man's accessory on the economic, social, and sexual levels. It is even more indispensable to reject the anxiety and separatism which feminism expresses in order to forcefully reaffirm the class root, which includes the women's army marching for their liberation. The condition of the proletarian woman. Zetkin. As far as the proletarian woman is concerned, it is capitalism's need to exploit and to search incessantly for a cheap labor force that has created the woman's question. It is for this reason, too, that the proletarian woman has become enmeshed in the mechanism of the economic life of our period and has been driven into the workshop into the machines. She went out into the economic life in order to aid her husband in making a living. That the capitalist mode of production transformed her into an unfair competitor. She wanted to bring prosperity to her family, but instead misery descended upon it. The proletarian woman obtained her own employment because she wanted to create a more sunny and pleasant life for her children, but instead she became almost entirely separated from them. She became an equal of the man as a worker. The machine rendered muscular force superfluous, and everywhere women's work showed the same results in production as men's work. And since women constitute a cheap labor force, and above all a submissive one, that only in the rarest of cases dares to kick against the thorns of capitalist exploitation, the capitalists multiply the possibilities of women's work and industry. As a result of all this, the proletarian woman has achieved her independence, but verily, the price was very high, and for the moment they have gained very little. If during the age of the family, a man had the right, just think of the law of electoral Bavaria, to tame his wife occasionally with a whip, capitalism is now taming her with scorpions. In former times, the rule of a man over his wife was ameliorated by their personal relationship. Between an employer and his worker, however, exists only a cash nexus. The proletarian woman has gained her economic independence, but neither as a human being nor as a woman or wife has she had the possibility to develop her individuality. For her task as a wife and a mother, there remain only the breadcrumbs which the capitalist production drops from the table. Therefore, the liberation struggle of the proletarian woman cannot be similar to the struggle that the bourgeois woman wages against the male of her class. She does not need to fight against the men of her class in order to tear down the barriers which have been raised against her participation in the free competition of the marketplace. Capitalism's need to exploit and the development of the modern mode of production totally relieves her of having to fight such a struggle. On the contrary, new banners need to be erected against the exploitation of the proletarian woman. Her rights as wife and mother need to be restored and permanently secured. Her final aim is not the free competition with the man, but the achievement of the political rule of the proletariat. The proletarian woman fights hand in hand with the man of her class against capitalist society. Zetkin, 76-77. Lafargue writes, "The laborers, as is always the case, have been the first to draw the logical consequences of the participation of woman in social production. They have replaced the ideal of the artisan, the wife who is nothing but a housekeeper, by a new ideal, woman as a companion in their economic and political struggles for the raising of wages and the emancipation of labor." Paul Lafargue. The Woman Question, 1904, in The Right to be Lazy and Other Studies, 1907, 114. Zetkin continues, "To be sure, she also agrees with the demands of the bourgeois women's movement, but she regards the fulfillment of these demands simply as a means to enable that movement to enter the battle, equipped with the same weapons, alongside the proletariat. The granting of political equality to women does not change the actual balance of power. The proletarian woman ends up in the proletarian, the bourgeois woman in the bourgeois camp. We must not let ourselves be fooled by socialist trends in the bourgeois women's movement, which last only as long as bourgeois women feel oppressed." Zetkin, 78. Kollontai specifies, "The proletarian women are waging war against the factors that are behind the modern form of family and marriage. Here we have the main difference between the bourgeois and proletarian approach to the difficult problem of the family." Kollontai, 68. From this analysis, the assumption seems clear, that women, all women, must deal with the problem of their democratic emancipation, where by democratic we mean equality with men, a goal not incompatible in itself with bourgeois society, but they cannot and should not group themselves together in an undifferentiated manner under a single feminist banner, because the various class positions present among women result in a corresponding divergence as to the final ends and means to be used in this struggle. But it is proletarian women who have the most difficult task to tackle, along with the men of their own class, any democratic demand using the methods of direct action and class struggle. Methods typical of the working class in general, not against men, but the entire society represented by the bourgeois state. This banner and this alone is the one that must fly over the head-on attack on all bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideologies, with a view to creating a battlefront on which all women who sincerely and passionately feel the need to free themselves from their condition of slavery can come together. 4. The party in the face of democratic claims. When Marxists speak of democratic demands, it is clear that they do not intend to speak of formal democracy, such as, for example, the rotten parliamentary game between political cliques, nor do they intend to give any weight to the idealistic and demagogic headcounts of the majorities and minorities, but rather to recognize in certain social and political demands elements of historical progress indispensable in the revolutionary process for the emancipation of the proletariat and of the whole of society. These demands are defined as democratic precisely because they do not concern a single class, for example the proletariat, but different social strata, indeed all the social strata from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. In short, they are all those rights of freedom and equality under the banner of which the bourgeois revolution took place. But was it not precisely and only the Marxist critique that demonstrated the impossibility of the bourgeoisie to be consistent with its own promises? Marxists demonstrated not only that the power of the bourgeoisie was based on the oppression of the proletarian class, the final historical class, but also the survival of historical forms that lagged behind capitalist development itself, such as the slavery of women to the domestic economy and their political and civil segregation. The bourgeois revolution had left out women, did not even apply to them the canons of formal democracy, all citizens are equal before the law and before the state, because, as we have seen, they were the subjects of special discriminating laws, which limited the entire stratum of women. This burden weighed on all women, except for the proletarians who had to bear two burdens, that of social and political discrimination, and that of the economy as they belonged to the class of the underprivileged. That is why it would be sectarian and negative for the revolution to delimit the feminine question to the pure worker sphere, to recognize the oppression of women only in the situation of working women. As Lenin exclaimed passionately during the famous conversation with Clara Zetkin in 1920, which she published in January 1925, "We hate, yes, hate everything, and will abolish everything which tortures and oppresses the woman worker, the housewife, the peasant woman, the wife of the petty trader, yes, and in many cases, the women of the possessing classes. The rights and social regulations which we demand for women from bourgeois society show that we understand the position and interests of women, and will have consideration for them under the proletarian dictatorship. Not, of course, as the reformists do, lulling them to inaction and keeping them in leading strings. No, of course not. But as revolutionaries who call upon the women to work as equals in transforming the old economy and ideology." Clara Zetkin, Reminiscences of Lenin. London, Modern Books Limited, 1929, 65. We seem to hear the anti-feminists interested in the status quo objecting, but how did Lenin not see the primacy of class? Is it possible that he addressed all women? Lenin was a superb revolutionary who knew how to handle the weapon of dialectics, not only in words but also in deeds, and he very well knew, as Russia teaches, that the class front was not to be sought in the field of demands, many of which were necessarily common to all women, but in the field of the means to be used for these purposes, and that these means were nothing more than the traditional ones of the labor movement and the Revolutionary Party. Direct action against the capitalist state, and not division between men and women. Proletarian unity of men and women who would participate in the struggle organized, independently of the other classes, in the party. In fact, if certain claims are common to all female people, the means to affirm them are not common precisely because the people are divided into antagonistic classes with different historical purposes. Precisely for this reason, only communists, who are the only ones today to proclaim this truth, can consequently also lead the struggle for democratic claims, to achieve the famous social justice that Democrats, in the words of yesterday and today, invoke at every step. It would therefore be wrong to identify democratic rights with democratic means, and to deny the former as negators of the latter. Lenin speaks again. The communist women's movement must itself be a mass movement, a part of the general mass movement, not only of the proletariat, but also of the exploited and oppressed, all the victims of capitalism or any other mastery. Ibid, 62. We will see later how Lenin intended to put himself practically on this ground of clash against the bourgeoisie. In the meantime, we want to go into the merits of three fundamental claims: freedom of divorce, of abortion, and of universal suffrage, that the party found itself not only evaluating, but, as they say, managing the day after the seizure of power in Russia. The right to vote. Although this particular promise has already been accepted in Western societies, the terms in which it was set by the Second and Third Communist International clarify the need for the struggle of women's political rights, even after the completion of the bourgeois revolution, and how the party has defined the class front within the women's movement. As stated in the resolution presented by Clara Zetkin at the Congress of the Socialist International in Stuttgart on the 22nd of August, 1907, the granting of suffrage to the female sex does not eliminate the class differences between the exploiters and the exploited, from which are derived the most serious social obstacles to the free and harmonious development of the female proletarian. It also does not eliminate the conflicts which are created for women as members of their sex from the social contradictions that occur between men and women within the capitalist system. On the contrary, the complete political equality of the female sex prepares the ground on which the conflicts will be fought with the greatest intensity. These conflicts are varied, but the most serious and painful one is the conflict between professional work and motherhood. For us socialists, therefore, women's suffrage cannot be the final goal, as it is for bourgeois women. It arms the female proletarians in their battle against class exploitation and class rule, in their effort to acquire their full humanity. It enables them to participate to a higher degree than heretofore in the attainment of political power by the proletariat. We socialists do not demand women's suffrage as a natural right with which women are born. We demand it as a social right which is anchored in the revolutionized economic activity and in the revolutionized social state and personal consciousness of women. The woman is detached from the household as the source of her livelihood, and she gains her independence from her family and her husband. In many cases, too, the family no longer offers her a satisfactory meaning of life. Just like the man under equally hard conditions, and at times under even more difficult ones, she has to take up the fight for the vital necessities against a hostile environment. She needs for this, just like the man, her full political rights, because such rights are weapons with which she can and must defend her interests. Together with her social being, her world of perception and thought is being revolutionized. The political impotence which the female sex accepted as natural for so many centuries is now viewed by her as an outrageous injustice. By a slow, painful development process, women are emerging from the narrowness of family life to the forum of political activity. They are demanding their full political equality as it is symbolized by suffrage as a vital social necessity and a social emancipation. The obtainment of suffrage is the necessary corollary to the economic independence of women. One would assume that in view of this situation, the entire politically and disenfranchised female sex would form one phalanx to fight for universal women's suffrage. But that is not the case at all. The bourgeois women do not even stand united and determined behind the principle of the full political equality of the female sex. They are even more reluctant to fight energetically, as one united force, for universal women's suffrage. In the final analysis, this is not due to the ignorance and short-sighted tactics of the leaders of the suffragettes' camp, even though they can be correctly blamed for a number of deficiencies. It is the inevitable consequence of the diverse social strata to which women belong. The value of enfranchisement stands in a reverse relationship to the size of the estate. It is of least importance to the women of the upper 10,000, and it means the most to female proletarians. Thus the struggle for women's suffrage, too, is dominated by class contradictions and class struggle. There cannot be a unified struggle for the entire sex, particularly when this battle does not relate to a bloodless principle, but rather to the concrete and vital question of the woman's right to vote. We cannot expect bourgeois women to proceed against their very nature. The female proletarians in their struggle for civil rights cannot, therefore, count on the support of the bourgeois woman, because the class contradictions preclude that female proletarians will join the bourgeois suffragette movement. All of this does not mean that they should reject the bourgeois suffragettes who want to march behind them or at their side in the battle for the women's right to vote. They may march separately, but fight together. But the female proletarians must know that they cannot acquire the right to vote in a struggle of the female sex without class distinctions against the male sex. No, it must be a class struggle of all the exploited without differences of sex against all exploiters, no matter what sex they belong to. Zetkin, 99-101. Freedom of divorce. Recent legislation in even the most advanced countries confirms the real difficulty for women in regaining their personal freedom from marriage. Therefore, the legal inferiority of women in general has not substantially changed, even in this field, while still today for the proletariat, there is often the economic impossibility of being able to emancipate themselves from the marriage bond. Lenin expresses himself in an article from 1916 on the subject of divorce. The reader will recall that the question of divorce was first posed by Rosa Luxemburg in the discussion on the national question. She expressed the perfectly justified opinion that we must, as centralist social democrats, insist that all major national issues, and divorce legislation is one of them, should come within the jurisdiction of the central government. This example clearly demonstrates that one cannot be a democrat and socialist without demanding full freedom of divorce now, because the lack of such freedom is an additional oppression of the oppressed sex. The conditions that make it impossible for the oppressed classes to exercise their democratic rights are not the exception under capitalism. They are typical of the system. In most cases, the right of divorce will remain unrealizable under capitalism, for the oppressed sex is subjugated economically. No matter how much democracy there is under capitalism, the woman remains a domestic slave, a slave locked up in the bedroom, nursery, kitchen. The right to elect their own people's judges, officials, school teachers, jurymen, etc., is likewise in most cases unrealizable under capitalism, precisely because of the economic subjection of the workers and the peasants. This same applies to the democratic republic. Our program defines it as government by the people, though all social democrats know perfectly well that under capitalism, even in the most democratic republic, there is bound to be bribery of officials by the bourgeoisie and an alliance of stock exchange and the government. Marxists know that democracy does not abolish class oppression. It only makes the class struggle more direct, wider, more open and pronounced, and that is what we need. The fuller the freedom of divorce, the clearer will women see that the source of their domestic slavery is capitalism, not lack of rights. The more democratic the system of government, the clearer will the workers see that the root evil is capitalism, not lack of rights. The fuller national equality, and it is not complete without freedom of secession, the clearer will the workers of the oppressed nations see that the cause of their oppression is capitalism, not lack of rights, etc. Under capitalism, the right of divorce, as all other democratic rights without exception, is conditional, restricted, formal, narrow, and extremely difficult of realization. Yet no self-respecting social democrat will consider anyone opposing the right of divorce a democrat, let alone a socialist. That is the crux of the matter. All democracy consists in the proclamation and realization of rights, which under capitalism are realizable only to a very small degree and only relatively. But without the proclamation of these rights, without a struggle to introduce them now, immediately, without training the masses in the spirit of this struggle, socialism is impossible. A Caricature of Marxism and Imperialist Economism, in Volume 23 of Collected Works, 1974, 72-74. The right to abortion and the atrocity of illegal abortion. We believe it is necessary to dwell in particular on the discussed right to abortion because it is better suited to demonstrating all the bourgeois hypocrisy given the doggedness, for example in Italy, that priests and vulgar objectors put in order to prevent the application of this law, when for years there has been silence on clandestine abortion and on all the moral and material miseries that accompany the lack of family planning. Clara Zetkin identified the conflict between professional work and motherhood, which she called the most serious and painful, as the most serious element in the emancipation of women. Zetkin, 99. The right to abortion is part of the plan of claims in favor of women to protect them, in certain historical periods, from the painful consequences of motherhood and to reduce their degree of subjection to the capitalist exploitation. The party does not consider the use of abortion as the best way to solve the social problems of women and the problem of misery in general, but rather as a consequence of class society and its bestial exploitation. Abortion practices are as old as the dreary society in which we live. In fact, to the deaths at work should be added the thousands of women who have died as a result of clandestine abortion practices and the thousands of children who have died or been mistreated for lack of the protection that capitalist society does not take on itself but imposes on the individual woman, even if proletarian on low wages or expelled from production for lack of work or because of too many children to look after. What do moralists and objectors think about the right to life of the low Neapolitans, where they curl up in the filth of a room up to 14 children? It should be noted, however, that, beyond these considerations, Lenin defines freedom of abortion as an aspect of defending fundamental democratic rights for citizens of both sexes. On the other hand, birth control is not a bourgeois claim, but a social necessity that every class and every mode of production cannot ignore, but that every class and every mode of production tries to solve for its own ends. Precisely for this reason, the communists cannot have a fixed scheme, yes to births or no to births, but as the bourgeoisie maneuvers this social function for capitalist ends, therefore against a part of society, the communists want to direct this function to bring it back to coincide with the very interest of the species, and that is, of the whole of society. The claim of free and unpaid abortion that so much opposition finds lies on this path. While the bourgeoisie, on the one hand, had to approve a partial law for its exploitation needs, on the other hand, it leaves its clerical allies free to fight it. Since the aim of the bourgeoisie is to maintain exploitation, there can be no other consequence than aberrant methods even in the field of birth regulation. Indifferently, the bourgeoisie gives rewards to the prolific families, which will obviously be proletarian families, when its thirst for profit requires a superproduction of workforce, an increase in the exploited. This is the true face of capitalism, which has only one moral, profit, that attempts to hide behind resounding social principles. Thus, on the one hand, it condemns prostitution, which it itself has provoked, and homosexuality as the product of some perverse glands of certain men and women, marginalizing them from society. On the other hand, it denies abortion in the name of the defense of life and defends marriage, already defined by us as the greatest legalized prostitution, in the name of love. We answer with Lenin that even the communists have only one moral, the social revolution, and they don't need to hide themselves behind any hypocritical preaching about life, even though they are the only ones compared to all the other sects and parties that they really care about. That is why we face the problem of abortion as materialists, thinking of what serves the struggle that, we want to repeat, is the organized expression of the immediate needs of the oppressed. One will object. Is it not Lenin who fought against the Malthusians, against their preaching for birth restriction? Of course, and we fully claim this battle against the small, fearful bourgeoisie, which, in moments of capitalist crisis, feels the malaise and fears the end of its privileges, and is all the more frightened by the danger of being sent back to the proletariat. The petty bourgeois has no historical perspective, does not foresee or desire the end of the capitalist regime, so birth restriction becomes its theory. The less we are and eat, the more we can survive, in an attempt to stem the crisis that oppresses it without resorting to revolution. Lenin fought this theory because it is harmful to the proletariat and its struggle, because it expresses his mistrust of the revolutionary future that the new generations will have to complete. The working class is not perishing, it is growing, becoming stronger, gaining courage, consolidating itself, educating itself, and becoming steeled in battle. We are already laying the foundations of a new edifice, and our children will complete its construction. Lenin, the working class in Neo-Malthusianism. So Lenin expresses himself on behalf of the whole working class in order to reject the slackness of the middle classes, but it is still Lenin who concludes by saying just as clearly that. It goes without saying that this does not by any means prevent us from demanding the unconstitutional annulment of all laws against abortion, or against the distribution of medical literature on contraceptive measures, etc., or against the distribution of medical literature on contraceptive measures, etc. Such laws are nothing but the hypocrisy of the ruling classes. These laws do not heal the ulcers of capitalism, they merely turn them into malignant ulcers that are especially painful for the oppressed masses. Ibid. The dictatorship of the proletariat in revolutionary Russia will prove this in practice with the law of the 20th of November, 1920. At a conference held in 1921, at the end of a long exposition on the situation of women, Alexandra Kollontai spoke about abortion. On the 20th of November, 1920, the Labor Republic issued a law abolishing the penalties that had been attached to abortion. What is the reasoning behind this new attitude? Russia, after all, suffers not from an overproduction of living labor, but rather from a lack of it. Russia is thinly, not densely populated. Every unit of labor power is precious. Why then have we declared abortion to be no longer a criminal offense? Hypocrisy and bigotry are alien to proletarian politics. Abortion is a problem connected with the problem of maternity, and likewise derives from the insecure position of women. We are not speaking here of the bourgeois class, where abortion has other reasons, the reluctance to divide an inheritance, the suffer of the slightest discomfort, to spoil one's figure or miss a few months of the season, etc. Abortion exists and flourishes everywhere, and no laws or punitive measures have succeeded in rooting it out. A way around the law is always found, but secret help only cripples women. They become a burden on the labor government, and the size of the labor force is reduced. Abortion, when carried out under proper medical conditions, is less harmful and dangerous, and the woman can get back to work quicker. Soviet power realizes that the need for abortion will only disappear on one hand when Russia has a broad and developed network of institutions protecting motherhood and providing social education, and on the other hand when women understand that childbirth is a social obligation. Soviet power has therefore allowed abortion to be performed openly and in clinical conditions. Besides the large-scale development of motherhood protection, the task of labor Russia is to strengthen in women the healthy instinct of motherhood, to make motherhood and labor for the collective compatible, and thus do away with the need for abortion. This is the approach of the Workers' Republic to the question of abortion, which still faces women in the bourgeois countries in all its magnitude. Women in bourgeois countries are struggling with the painful situation generated by the world wars, the Cold War, and now the War on Terror. They succumb under a double burden, wage labor for capital and motherhood. As soon as the woman will be viewed as being an essential labor unit, the key to the solution of the complex question of maternity can be found. In bourgeois society, where housework complements the system of capitalist economy and private property creates a stable basis for the isolated form of the family, there is no way out for the working woman. Kollontai, 148. This is how Marxists think. Let us fight for the development of a healthy maternal instinct that will be the basis of a harmonious development of the species, but not with empty sermons to the thousands of women oppressed by tremendous burdens, and even sparing our contempt for that certain hypocritical feeling regarding children in the embryonic stage, feelings that usually dwell in the hearts of those who do not know the material and moral suffering of the thousands of mothers with no way out. In his book The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky speaks of the period in which the Stalinist counter-revolution was turning back all the conquests of October. Among other things, the family, the formidable bastion of bourgeois conservation, had to be reevaluated. It was therefore necessary to interrupt the process of emancipation of women with the usual formulas all too well known in the bourgeois West. The joys of motherhood, repealing the law on accessible and free abortion. The mass homelessness of children is undoubtedly the most unmistakable and most tragic symptom of the difficult situation of the mother. On this subject, even the optimistic Pravda is sometimes compelled to make a bitter confession. The birth of a child is for many women a serious menace to their position. It is just for this reason that the revolutionary power gave women the right to abortion, which in conditions of want and family distress, whatever may be said upon this subject by the eunuchs and old maids of both sexes, is one of her most important civil, political, and cultural rights. However, this right of women too, gloomy enough in itself, is under the existing social inequality being converted into a privilege. Bits of information trickling into the press about the practice of abortion are literally shocking. Thus, through only one village hospital in one district of the Urals, there passed in 1935 195 women mutilated by midwives. Among them 33 factory workers, 28 clerical workers, 65 collective farm workers, 58 housewives, etc. This Ural district differs from the majority of other districts only in that information about it happened to get into the press. How many women are mutilated every day throughout the extent of the Soviet Union? Having revealed its inability to serve women who are compelled to resort to abortion with the necessary medical aid and sanitation, the state makes a sharp change of course and takes the road of prohibition. One of the members of the highest Soviet court, Solts, a specialist on matrimonial questions, bases the forthcoming prohibition of abortion on the fact that in a socialist society where there are no unemployed, etc., a woman has no right to decline the joys of motherhood. The philosophy of a priest, endowed also with the powers of a gendarme. We just heard from the central organ of the ruling party that the birth of a child is for many women, and it would be truer to say for the overwhelming majority, a menace to their position. We just heard from the highest Soviet institution that the liquidation of homeless and uncared children is being weakly carried out, which undoubtedly means a new increase of homelessness. But here the highest Soviet judge informs us that in a country where life is happy, abortion should be punished with imprisonment, just exactly as in capitalist countries where life is grievous. It is clear in advance that the Soviet Union, as in the West, those who will fall into the claws of the jailer will be chiefly working women, servants, peasant wives, who find it hard to conceal their troubles. As far as concerns our women, who furnish the demand for fine perfumes and an indulgent judiciary, we have need of people, concludes Solts, closing his eyes to the homeless. Then have the kindness to bear them yourselves, might be the answer to the high judge of millions of toiling women, if the bureaucracy had not sealed their lips with the seal of silence. These gentlemen have, it seems, completely forgotten that socialism was to remove the cause which impels women to abortion, and not force her into the joys of motherhood with the help of a foul police interference in what is to every woman the most intimate sphere of life. Leon Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed, London, Faber and Faber, 1937, 144-145. This is how all women today must respond to the priest, the policeman, or their own man who, out of cowardice, adapts and submits to the bourgeois rules, above all because his son will not be his burden. This means that in bourgeois society, everything is at peace because everything is in function of capital. Limiting births as well as encouraging them serves to increase profits. This is why there is no such thing as preventive medicine, since it could only involve the entire social and productive sphere, and therefore the aims pursued by the class that holds power. To have a legal abortion is no more dangerous than to have a tooth legally removed. If the extraction of teeth were prohibited, there would be thousands of deaths due to clandestine dental practices. Only, since abortion is linked to maintaining the oppression of women through the maintenance of the family, it is prohibited, and therefore made 1,000 times more dangerous. Only communism will free women's full individuality and sociality. Of course, abortion is a sad right, as Trotsky says, because millions of women are truly forced to give up the joys of motherhood, and every human being suffers if only one of their organic activities is prevented. In socialism, as it will be possible to prevent and minimize dental caries, just to keep up with our example, so we will try to prevent opportunities for abortion. As a transitional phase, we are fighting for free, no-cost abortion, and we will apply it where we can gain power, to bring it at least to the level of a legal dental extraction. This does not mean socialism, but reduction of the suffering of the proletarian humanity, the first task of every communist. One more word on this subject. One must not think that socialism will be the cold and mechanical submission of individual needs to the general needs of society that would justify itself by calling itself of species. If, for example, we were to say that the women of socialism will give birth every time it is imposed on them by the socialist organization, nothing would be done. On the contrary, it is precisely in socialism that the individual will find his full realization, even in the inevitable personal differentiations, the full and free expression of his individuality, and only socialism can eliminate the contradiction between individual and society. We quote further Bebel on this subject. Even at present, most women have an aversion against a too numerous progeny, and this aversion is likely to increase rather than decrease, regardless of the care that a socialistic society will bestow upon pregnant women and mothers. This is the main reason why, in our opinion, the increase of population is likely to progress more slowly in socialist society than it does in bourgeois society. Our Malthusians assuredly have no cause to rack their brains in regard to the increase of the population in the future. Until now, nations have been ruined by a diminution of their numbers, but never yet by an excess. In a society living according to natural laws, the number of the population will ultimately be regulated without harmful abstinence or unnatural preventive measures. Bebel, 498. In the socialist state, therefore, women will be free to have children or not. They will not be forced to abort or give birth as in bourgeois society. The law on the liberalization of abortion, appropriate to the Proletarian Party, will not at some point be repealed, but will spontaneously fall into disuse when the material conditions of social organization allow it. In the same way, the bourgeois family, supplanted by community life in all its forms, will become extinct. The children will no longer weigh on the mothers, but the mothers will be able to remain with their own children if they wish, finally expressing an authentic maternal feeling, since it is no longer produced by selfishness towards their own offspring, no longer deformed by the obscene practice of starving the children of others to feed and fatten their own. Further, as Kollontai writes, working mothers have no need to be alarmed. Communists do not intend to take children away from their parents or to tear the baby from the breast of its mother, and neither is it planning to take violent measures to destroy the family. No such thing. The aims of communist society are quite different. Communist society sees that the old type of family is breaking up, and that the old pillars which supported the family as a social unit are being removed. The domestic economy is dying, and working-class parents are unable to take care of their children or provide them with sustenance and education. Parents and children suffer equally from this situation. Communist society has this to say to the working woman and working man. You are young. You love each other. Everyone has the right to happiness. Therefore, live your life. Do not flee happiness. Do not fear marriage, even though under capitalism marriage was truly a chain of sorrow. Do not be afraid of having children. Society needs more workers and rejoices at the birth of every child. You do not have to worry about the future of your child. Your child will know neither hunger nor cold. There is no escaping the fact. The old type of family has had its day. The family is withering away, not because it is being forcibly destroyed by the state, but because the family is ceasing to be a necessity. The state does not need the family, because the domestic economy is no longer profitable. The family distracts the workers from more useful and productive labor. The members of the family do not need the family either, because the task of bringing up the children, which was formerly theirs, is passing more and more into the hands of the collective. In place of the old relationship between men and women, a new one is developing. A union of affection and comradeship, a union of two equal members of communist society, both of them free, both of them independent, and both of them workers. No more domestic bondage for women, no more inequality within the family. No need for women to fear being left without support and with children to bring up. The woman in communist society no longer depends upon her husband, but on her work. It is not in her husband, but in her capacity to work, that she will find support. She need have no anxiety about her children. The worker state will assume responsibility for them. Marriage will lose all the elements of material calculation which cripple family life. Marriage will be a union of two persons who love and trust each other. Such a union promises to the working men and working women, who understand themselves and the world around them, the most complete happiness and the maximum satisfaction. Instead of the conjugal slavery of the past, communist society offers women and men a free union which is strong in the comradeship which inspired it. Once the conditions of labor have been transformed and the material security of the working woman has increased, and once marriage, such as the church used to perform it, this so-called indissoluble marriage which was at bottom merely a fraud, has given place to the free and honest union of men and women who are lovers and comrades. Kollontai, 257-259. This hymn to love and the defense of life, expressed not by hypocritical bourgeois poets or mercenary objectors, but by a militant revolutionary in the midst of the struggle, concludes the analysis of the condition of women in bourgeois society and of the demands indispensable for their emancipation, or rather, for the liberation of all humanity from the prehistory of humanity that is capitalist society. Now it remains to be seen how the party intends to organize these masses of super-exploited people in order to lead them in the revolutionary struggle together with the whole proletariat towards the conquest of power.